Good morning. Let's welcome you all for another session on cryptography, network security, and cyber law. Today we will continue our module 3, session 6, wherein we'll be discussing mainly on authentication techniques. Now, the agenda of today's discussion is centralized authentication, and also we will discuss Needham Schroeder protocol, which is based on centralized authentication. At the end of the session, you will be able to describe what centralized authentication is, why we go for it, and also you'll be able to explain Needham Schroeder protocol and various versions of this. Now let's begin our discussion on the centralized authentication. Key distribution center, as we call it, it is a trusted third party. Now, key distribution center is used in order to provide keys to the client and the servers, and the keys that are provided are of long-term keys. They are used for the they're used by the clients and the servers for a longer duration of time. Now, there are two protocols that are mainly based on the use of key distribution center. One is the Needham Schroeder protocol and the other one is the Kerberos protocol. Now, in today's session, we'll be discussing about Needham Schroeder protocol, and in the subsequent session, we'll discuss on Kerberos protocol. Now, why we started with the usage of centralized authentication, or what is the need for using centralized authentication? Let us recall the advantage of secret key cryptography over the public key cryptography, which is used for authentication techniques. Over here, we can see that the public key cryptography requires public key infrastructure and the digital certificate support in order to provide authentication using PKC. And the cost of setting up and maintaining a PKI is very expensive. And also we can see that the public-private key operations are slow as that when compared to SKC. Now, first is in order to support authentication using the public key cryptography, we need a public key infrastructure along with the support of digital certificates. And having this public key infrastructure, setting it up and maintaining it incurs a huge cost. And also these public key operations are very slow as compared to that of symmetric key cryptography. Now, of course, symmetric key cryptography also has lot of disadvantages associated. Now, let's look at the disadvantages of symmetric key cryptography. Now, first thing that we have seen is exchanging of the secret key between the two communicating parties. And if one of the communicating parties has very large number of is communicating with very large number of recipients, in that case it must have one key or one secret key with all of these other communicating parties. Now, in such a case, managing and securely storing such large number of keys is a tedious task. It's not an easy task. Now, having understood the disadvantage associated with symmetric key cryptography, though it is having a plus point over the public key cryptography, let us see what other way we have in order to achieve authentication. Now, the method that we discuss over here, we call it as centralized authentication. Now, it is called as centralized authentication because we employ a trusted third party in order to provide the authentication service. Now, this trusted third party is also called as Key Distribution Center or KDC. In this Key Distribution Center scenario, each user, that is each communicating party, registers itself with the Key Distribution Center and chooses a password. Now, this password, the function of this password will provide us with a long-term secret. A long-term secret, which is the function of the password, is to be exclusively shared between the user and the KDC. Now, we have the user and the KDC over here. We can see that the user and the KDC share the long-term password. And how does it get this long-term password? It obtains this long-term password by applying a function over the password. Okay, the main function of KDC is to securely communicate a fresh common session key between the two communicating parties. Now this fresh session key will be used for subsequent communication between the two communicating parties. Now let's look at this scenario to get a clear picture of what we mean by centralized authentication and the process involved in it. Now over here we can see that A and B are the two communicating parties who wish to communicate with each other, and KDC is the key distribution center which is helping the communicating parties in order to authenticate themselves. Now what does A do? A wishes to communicate with B. That information is sent as a message from A to the KDC. Over here we can see in the message 1 the contents include A. A stands for the identity of this particular user A, and also it sends a message saying that I wish to communicate with B. Now this message is received by the key distribution center. Once it receives this message, what it does is it generates a session key called as KAB. Now after generating this session key KAB, now second thing that it does is it encrypts this particular message. Now it encrypts this using KA and also KB. For user A it uses KA, and for user B it uses KB to encrypt the session key. Okay, now we can see over here KDC sends this message to which it has generated. The session key is encrypted using KA and then send it to A. Similarly, KDC is sending a message to B which contains the session key which is encrypted using KB. Now the question that arises over here is, what are these KA and KB? We know that this is a session key. Now KAB is a session key. Now what is this KA and KB? KA and KB are the long-term keys that are shared between KDC and A, KDC and B respectively. Okay, now the next question that arises is, after the users A and B receive this particular message sent by the KDC, what do they do? Now let's check what it does. A will decrypt this message which it has received using the long-term key which it is sharing with that of KDC. Upon decryption, A will obtain the session key. Okay, it will obtain the session key KAB. Similarly, what B does is that it will also decrypt the received message using the key that it is sharing between KDC and itself. Once decryption is performed, even B is having access to the session key. Using this session key, A and B can encrypt the subsequent messages they wish to communicate with each other. Now let's have a recap of this in terms of description. So first, what's happening here? The message 1, A informs the KDC that it wants to communicate with B. Now KDC generates a random secret which we call it as session key. After generating it, it dispatches this by encrypting it to both A and B. Now in the message 2, we can see that the encrypted information, that is the encrypted session key, which is encrypted using the long-term secret KA, is received by A, which is sent to A is received by A. Similarly, message 3 is encrypted with KB, this shared secret between B and KDC. Once these two messages are received, they will automatically decrypt it and then retrieve the session key. Now this session key, remember KAB, we also call it as short term key, short term session key. Now this is called a short term session key because it lives for a very short duration of time. We use it for that particular session only. Now again, if A and B want to communicate with each other, they establish a new session, and a new session key is provided by the KDC. Now having understood this, now this structure or this arrangement of KDC along with its users and providing authentication is susceptible to various types of attacks, which we call as replay attack and man in the middle attack. Now what is a replay attack? A replay attack is one wherein the eavesdropper is listening to the messages that are exchanged between two communicating parties and then floating those messages back into the network after some sort of delay. Now the messages which are received even after delay may be assumed to be a fresh message and service could be provided. Now another attack that is possible in this centralized authentication scenario is man in the middle attack. We have seen man in the middle attack in Diffie-Hellman key exchange, wherein over here one of the communicating party is impersonated and then the attacker will try to prove that it is a genuine source to the other end. Now let's see how to subdue these attacks with the help of Needham-Schroeder protocol. Now we have in Needham-Schroeder protocol 3 versions that we will be discussing. First version we call it as preliminary version 1, and the second version is called as preliminary version 2, and the third version we call it as preliminary version 3. Now the previous scenario that we have discussed, we will make an improvision on this particular scenario. Now let's have a look on the first version of Needham-Schroeder protocol. Now over here there is a slight change as that we compare when we compare it to the centralized authentication technique. What is the change? Over here A and B are trying to mutually authenticate with each other. Now let's see how they are done and what is the process involved. Now let's have a look at this particular diagram. Over here A is the communicating party who is wishing to communicate with user B, and KDC is a trusted third party which is responsible for helping A and B get a session key. Now how is this achieved? A sends a message to the key distribution center, wherein this message contains the identity of A along with the identity of B. Over here upon receiving the message, KDC will understand that the user A is trying to establish a communication with B. User A is trying to establish a communication with that of B. Now what does KDC do upon receiving this message from A? It first generates a session key KAB. Now after generating a session key KAB, it will create a message that needs to be sent to user B. Now what does this message contain? This message contains the information that A is wishing to communicate. A is wishing to communicate, and this is the session key that needs to be used to communicate to to A. Now this entire information that A is wishing to communicate along with the session key that should be used for further communication is encrypted using the long term key that is shared between, over here we can see EB. This is a key, long term key shared between B and the KDC. Now this entire message, second half of the message, is intended to B. Now A also needs a session key. Now what does the KDC do? It will include the session key KAB for A. Over here we can see that KAB is included. This KAB will be used by A, and this entire message is encrypted using the key KA, which is the key which is shared by A and KDC. Now upon receiving the second message, what does A do? First, A will decrypt the message using the key that it shares, long-term key that it shares with KDC. First is decryption. Now upon decryption, what does it get? It gets a session key KAB. After obtaining the session key KAB, the user A will generate a random nonce called as R1. This is the challenge that will be sent to B in order to perform mutual authentication. Along with this, now let's look at what A sends to B. Now A is retaining the entire half of the message that it has received from KDC. Now this is the entire message that can be simply retrieved by decrypting using the key KA, and then it can be embedded in the next message that is needed to be sent to B. Along with that, A has generated a random nonce R1, which is a challenge, and it is encrypted using KAB. Now from where did this session key come from, which is used for encryption? Now this key has come from here. Okay. This cannot be decrypted by A. This part of the message cannot be decrypted by A, but it can be just sent as it is to B. Upon receiving, what does B do? B can decrypt the message that is received in message 3 using KB. Decrypt using KB in order to obtain the message details that A is wishing to communicate, and this is the session key which has to be used for further communication. Now using this particular session key, it will obtain session key, right? Now this session key it will use in order to decrypt this second half of the message that it has received from A. Upon decrypting this particular second half of the message, B is able to retrieve the random nonce R1. Now what does B do then? B has to revert back to A. How does it revert back to A? Now what B does is it again generates a random nonce R2. Okay, it generates R2. Upon generating R2, it uses this R2 as a new challenge which is sent to A. But what does it do with R1? It will decrement this particular nonce and include it in the message. Over here we can see that it is included here. This R1 is received from A and it will decrement and include in the message along with the new challenge that B has generated. Now both of these nonces are encrypted using the session key which B has received from A in the message 3. Over here we can see that KDC is not directly sending any message to B, but it is sharing the session key through A to B. Now upon receiving the message 4, what does A do? What does the user A do? User will decrypt that particular message. Okay, after decrypting this message, it will get the random nonce R1 minus 1, along with that a new challenge which is posed by B, R2. Now the receipt of this particular challenge or acceptance of this challenge can be reverted back to B by decrementing it by 1 and encrypting it. This is decremented by 1, R2 minus 1 is decrementing, and then encrypting it using the session key KAB. Upon receiving it, B will decrypt this message using the session key and check whether the nonce it has sent and the one it has received in message 5 is just one less than the one it has sent in message 4. Now let's understand this process with the help of description. Now over here, now mutual authentication is provided by the step number 3, 4 and 5, wherein A and B are authenticating with each other. Now how are they authenticating? In order to authenticate, they are using challenge response phase or challenge response protocol. Now here both the ends, that is A and B, challenge the other to prove that they have the knowledge of the session key KAB. For these, in order to pose these challenges, it uses a random number called as nonce. Now these nonces are usually generated using pseudo-random generators. Now the response involves decrementing the nonce. We have seen here in the message 4 and 5. Now whenever they receive a challenge, they will just decrement it and encrypt it using the session key. Now let's look at this particular protocol, that is preliminary version 1 with this particular diagram. Now over here we will just have a recap whatever we have discussed. In message 1, A is sending a message to the key distribution center saying that it wants to communicate with B. What is B doing in response? What is KDC doing in response? KDC is enclosing a ticket to B. This part is called as ticket to B. Along with that, it is sending the session key, which is encrypted using the long term key shared between A and KDC. This is called as what? Ticket. Now the message 3, which is generated by A, forwards this particular ticket to B. Along with that, it will generate a nonce which is encrypted using the session key KAB. Now upon receiving this message, what does B do? B will decrypt the message and then once it retrieves the session key, it will use this session key in order to decrypt the second half of the message. Now the second half of the message will contain a challenge which is sent by A. Now this challenge which is received will be decremented. Along with that, B will again generate a challenge called as R2, encrypt both of them using the session key which it has just received from A. Upon receiving this message sent by B, A will decrypt it, check whether the decremented value is equal to the value it has sent, and this should be 1 less than the value it has sent in message 3. Now again, what will A do? A will reply back to user B, and in this reply it sends the decremented challenge or the nonce which is encrypted using the session key. Now having understood this preliminary version 1 of Needham Schroeder protocol, let us see what are the possible attacks in case of this particular scenario. Over here we can see that the same situation wherein A, KDC and B are intending to communicate with each other, wherein the key distribution center is trying to help A and B get a session key for communication. Now X is an intruder. Now what does X do? The attacker X is an insider who shares the long-term key with that of KDC. He is not an outsider but an insider within an organization who is trying to get to know the communication between A and B. So he also has a long-term secret key or long-term key that is shared between KDC and itself. Now the attacker X intercepts the message that is sent by A to KDC. Now instead of B, what it is doing is it is substituting B with that of X. Okay, and then sending it to the key distribution center. Upon receiving this message, same way as it did in the previous scenario, key distribution center is generating a session key. But over here we can see that the session key is generated between A and X. So the KAX represents the session key that is shared between A and X. And also it generates a ticket that needs to be sent to X. Now what does this ticket contain? It contains the identity of A along with the session key KAX, which is encrypted using EX, a long-term key shared between X and KDC. Now A also needs a session key. For that, KDC includes the session key, which is encrypted using the long-term secret shared between A and KDC. Now once A receives this message, what happens in response? Now all this is understood, which happens in the KDC creates a ticket and encrypts and sends it to A. Now X, after receiving this message, A will devise the message and send it to B, but this message is received by X. Now this ticket will be received by X. X will decrypt it and obtain the session key and know that this session key is coming from A. And using this session key, it will decrypt the second half of the message, which contains the challenge generated by A. Now what does X do? It will never allow the message to this message to reach B, and then X will also generate a nonce R2, decrement the challenge it received from A, and then encrypt entire information using the key using the session key between A and X. Upon receiving this message, A will in turn again decrypt it and then check whether the nonce which it sent is equal to the nonce it received, but less by 1, and also it will receive the nonce which is sent by X, decrement it and encrypt it using the session key EAX and then send it to X. Now since A was intending to communicate with B and that was the information it sent to KDC, A will always think that it is still communicating with B but not with X. But X is able to perform this man in the middle attack. Now X is able to successfully impersonate B to the user A. How do we avoid this man in the middle attack? Now another improvisation was provided by Needham Schroeder in preliminary version 2 of this particular protocol. Now let's see what's happening here and how a fix is provided for the preliminary version 1. Now the scenario remains the same, wherein there are 3 entities which are communicating in order to prove their genuinity, that is authentication. Now what is A doing? Let's look at this diagram and understand. A is sending a message to KDC. Now the only difference that happens over here as compared to that of the version 1 is in the message 2. Now let's look at this. A is sending a message to KDC saying that it wants to communicate to B. So both the identities are included in the message and sent to KDC. Upon receiving, what does KDC do? KDC will generate a session key which will be used by A and B. Now this entire part we know that it is called as ticket, and this ticket has to be simply sent to B by A. Along with that, KDC is including a identity to which this particular ticket is intended to, or to whom it is intended to. Along with that, the session key which will be used by A is also encrypted using the long-term key shared by A and KDC. Now over here in the previous session we were not including the identity of B in the message 2. Now in the third step, what happens is A, upon receiving it, will decrypt and obtain the session key. Now this session key will be used to encrypt the nonce R1, which is a challenge posed by A to B. Now after doing this, what does A do? It will simply include the entire ticket and send it to B. Now ticket along with the challenge, which is encrypted using the session key of AB, is sent to B. What does B do? B will first decrypt this first half of the message, obtain the session key. Using this session key, it will decrypt this challenge. Now the same process occurs here. It will decrypt the challenge it obtained from A, generate a challenge to be sent to A. This process for mutual authentication repeats. Now in the message 1, what was happening is A was identifying itself along with the identity of the user with which it wants to communicate, which is B. Now in response, the key distribution center encloses the ticket to B, and this ticket will contain the details identity of A along with the session key KAB, which is encrypted using the long term key shared between B and that of KDC. Also, it includes B's identity. Now, after A receives and decrypts the message 2, she checks whether B's identity is contained inside the message. The presence of B's identity is very important. The presence of B's identity confirms to A that KDC knows that A wishes to communicate with B. So, this is a way to avoid the man in the middle attack. Now, what happens in message 3? A then forwards the ticket along with the challenge B challenge, which is encrypted using the session key to B, and this challenge is R1. In message 4, R1 is decrypted and B challenges A with R2, which is sent in an encrypted form. Message 5, R2 is decrypted by A and forwarded back to B. Now let's see if man in the middle attack and the replay attack are possible on the preliminary versions too. Now the attacker X over here does the following. What is it doing? Now let's try to understand this this scenario with the help of a diagram. What exactly an attacker X is doing? Now over here, A is wishing to communicate with B. Now this is the message sent by A to the key distribution center. Now what happens next? X is intercepting the KDC's message. The KDC will generate obviously a session key, and along with that this is the ticket which is intended to B and the identity of B and the session key which is used by A. All of this is encrypted using the long term key. Now we are aware of this particular thing. Now what is X doing? X is intercepting this message which is sent by KDC, which is intended to reach A, and instead what it does is it plays a previous recording of message 2. In this message that is replayed by X, we can see that over here we can see that X is careful to replay a copy of this particular message 2, which he has recorded before B's key was compromised. This message contains the old key that is used by B. KB is the old key which was used by the user B. Now let's understand the further process. Upon receiving this message, what does A do? Now A doesn't even get to know that this message it receives contains an encrypted ticket, and this ticket is with B's old key KB. It is encrypted using B's old key KB. Now what happens further? X then A will send a message as it is without being aware that the keys are compromised. A will send a message to B. Now X will intercept this message 3, which is coming from A, which contains the old ticket and the fresh challenge to B. Now because X has access to B's old key, he can decrypt this ticket and recover the session key AB. Upon recovering the session key, what happens is X will decrypt this particular nonce or the challenge, generate a nonce and send to A message. Now this is happening because X is aware of the session key KAB dash, which is represented here. Over here, KAB dash. Upon receiving this message, what will A do? A will decrypt this message and then check the challenge it received from X, verify its own challenge, and then send a reply back to X by decrementing the nonce that it has received. X will again intercept this particular message and not allow this message to reach B. Upon this message reaching X, X will decrypt it and then check whether it is successfully authenticated with that of A. Now over here, X is able to again impersonate B to A. A will always think that it is communicating with B, but rather it is communicating with X. So even in the case of preliminary version 2, what is possible? Man in the middle attack is possible by an insider. Also, we can note that along with the man in the middle attack, there is the replay that is occurring. The old message is being replayed by X, and this old message uses the long term key which they had shared previously. So this preliminary version 2 is not able to combat both replay attack, nor it is able to suppress the man in the middle attack. So let's see what happens in preliminary version 3. Now let's check whether this is able to overcome these two attacks. The vulnerability in version 2 is fixed by ensuring the freshness of the message 2. Now the attack, we have seen that it is possible because A was not able to recognize that old message is replayed to it by the intruder X. Now let's see how we can ensure this freshness of message and avoid the replay. Now how do we avoid this? This can be accomplished by A sending a fresh nonce in the message 1. So A is sending the identity of B with which it wants to communicate. Along with that, it is sending a nonce R3. Now this nonce is used to avoid replay attacks. Upon receiving this information, what will the key distribution center do? It will confirm that it has received the message from A. Now this confirmation has to be sent to A through message 2. Now let's see what are the ingredients of message 2. It contains a ticket which is to be sent by A to B. Along with that, it has a session key that will be used by the user A and the identity of B, which is represented as a letter B, and also the nonce it received from A. Now this nonce will tell A that the message is fresh because it was generated by A and sent to KDC. Upon receiving this message, the rest of the communication is almost similar to the one we have discussed earlier. A will send the ticket it received in the message 2 along with the challenge R1, which is encrypted using the session key. B will receive this, decrypt it. Upon decrypting, it will decrement the nonce and then create a new nonce, which is a challenge to A in order to mutually authenticate. Again, A will also receive the message, decrypt it, and then again send to B. Now over here, the only difference as compared to that of previous version is A is generating a nonce and sending it to KDC in order to avoid the replay attack. KDC, when it replies back to A, includes this nonce it has received from A. A will check from its database whether this is the freshly generated nonce. If it is a freshly generated nonce, it will simply accept it. Otherwise, it will reject this particular communication. Now, is there any sort of attack that is possible on this preliminary version which is trying to avoid the replay attack? Let's look at this scenario. Over here, X attempts to steal A's password or a long-term key which it shares with the KDC. And how is it doing it? Now, let's see this. Over here, X is between A and KDC. Now, what X does is it keeps on stealing the information or recording the information that is being exchanged between the user A and the KDC. Now, X in this listening or recording of messages is able to or manages to steal the message, to steal the long-term key which is shared between A and KDC. So, it is able to steal the long-term key which is shared between A and the KDC. Now, let's assume a scenario wherein A is aware that its key has been compromised and it has requested KDC for a fresh replacement. Now, having a key compromised and making a request, there is a X duration. Now, during this duration of time, A should not be part of any communication. Now, but let us look at how X will utilize this time duration wherein A's key is compromised and also it has requested the KDC for a fresh key. Now, this small duration of time can be utilized by A in order to impose a impersonation attack. Let's look at this scenario. X is sending a message to B and this message contains A dash is the old password generated key. Now, over here we can see it is the old key and A is the new password generated key. Now, in the message over here we can see that the ticket that is sent to B contains the information KA dash of B. This is the session key which is generated using the old key of A. Fine. Now, using this old key of A, X has obtained the session key. Now, this session key is used by X to impersonate A. Now, what is it doing? It is generating a random nonce R1 and trying to pretend it is A. It is encrypting the message using the session key, using the old session key, that is KA dash B. Now, this is the old ticket. Old session key is used for encrypting the new challenge R1. Upon receiving this message, what does B do? B will think it is a fresh communication that is occurring between A and B. It is not aware that X is impersonating A. So, it will again continue with the process of retrieving this session key by decrypting this message first and checking this challenge, and using it will decrement this challenge, generate a new challenge, encrypt it again using the old session key and send this message to A. X intercepts this message and continues to mutually authenticate with B, pretending to be A. Now, over here we can say again that the intruder X is able to impersonate A, and B and A are just unaware that a communication is established by the intruder. Now, all these are descriptions of those steps. Now, how do we avoid this? Now, the problems in the previous versions could be fixed if B were allowed to choose a nonce R4, where enclosed by KDC in the ticketed nonce which was enclosed in the KDC, in the ticket it generates in message 2. Now, let us see how this is done. Over here in the message 1, what is A saying? A is saying that it is intending to communicate with B, and this is sent by A to B. Over here it is not sent to the KDC, but over here it is a point to observe that it is sent to the user B. What does user B do? It will generate a random number R4 and then encrypt using the long term key which is shared between the KDC and B and send it to A. Upon receiving this message, this entire message is retained as it is and sent to KDC. Along with that, A will also send that it wants to communicate with that of B, its own identity, the communicating party with which it wants to communicate its identity, along with a new random number R3, and retain whatever message it received from B to A. All of these information is sent to the KDC, and A tells the KDC that it wants a session key to communicate with B. Now what does the KDC do? In the message 3, after A forwards its challenge along with R3 and R4. Now in the message 4 we can see that KDC generates a ticket which includes R4. Now this is the ticket that is generated. Earlier we just had the identity of A along with the session key that will be used for further communication. But we can see that there is a change in the final version wherein we have R4. From where did KDC get this R4? First, A received this random number nonce 4 from B, and this was sent to KDC by A. And and this random number R4 is now a part of ticket. Along with this ticket, what else is sent to A? The random number or the nonce it received from A and the identity of the end user with which A is wishing to communicate, which it had sent in message 3 to KDC. Also, the KDC will include the session key which is encrypted using the long term key it shares with the KDC. Now over here the only difference that we observe, there are two differences that we need to note, that is the ticket contains the nonce which was generated by B itself, and also the other part of the message contains the nonce which is generated by A, which was received by KDC. Both of these nonces were received by KDC in message 3. Now what happens in message 5? A, upon receiving this information, that is message 4, it will first decrypt this message. Now upon decryption, what does A get? A will get the session key. It's able to retrieve the session key along with the communicating party with which it intends to communicate, and also the nonce. Now this entire part is just retained as it is and sent in message 5 to KDC. Now over here we can see this part is just included as it is and sent to B. This is a ticket which B will utilize in order to retrieve its session key. Also, A will generate a new nonce R1 which it will use to mutually authenticate itself to B. Now this R1 is encrypted using the session key which A has just received from the KDC. Upon receiving this message, what does B do? B will first deal with the first half of the message in order to retrieve the session key. Upon retrieving the session key, B will also check whether this is a fresh message and not a replayed message. Now R4 is a nonce which is generated by B itself, and it will check whether the generated nonce and the received nonce is same. If they are same, it will proceed with decrypting and accepting the challenge which is sent by A. Now if the message or the challenge is acceptable by B, B will over here we can there is another message which is sent by A to B. What does this message contain? It contains the decrypted value of the nonce. Along with that, it also contains a new random or the random nonce or a challenge which is generated by A. Upon receiving this message, B will again decrypt it and check whether this is an appropriate nonce and not a replayed message. Also, A will generate another message which is intended to B. In this message 7. Now, this message 7 has a random nonce which is sent to B, and this nonce is decremented by 1 by A itself and encrypted using the session key shared between A and B. Now, what we understand by this final version is, since there are a lot of random nonces that are used which will act as a challenge for the communicating parties in order to authenticate itself, we see that we are able to avoid the man in the middle attack and also the replay attack. Now, this final bug-free version of Needham Schroeder protocol is widely used when a centralized authentication is possible. We have come to the end of the session, wherein we have understood what we mean by centralized authentication and what are the function of a key, what is the function of a key distribution center. Along with that, we have seen various versions of Needham Schroeder protocol, the first 3 versions, and what are the possible replay attack or the man in the middle attack, and how we avoid it using the final version. Thank you. And in the next session, we will be discussing about Kerberos protocol and also biometrics that are used for authentication. If in case you have any queries, you can just ping me over these details, that is my email and contact number. Thank you.